Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 3, American Federalism of the American Government, 3rd edition textbook from Open Stax. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about federalism, how the states and the federal government function with one another in here in the United States. So basic definition of federalism is basically a form of government in which different levels of government act relatively autonomously but have power to act directly on people. So within federalism, we have a central government and a sort of regional government that work hand in hand together. In the United States, we refer to federalism as the national federal government. And of course, the various states here in the United States, the 50 states that we have as territorial governments, as of course the other section of America, federalism. So, of course, in the United States, we have the 50 states, and also territories that the United States continues. So one example of a territory that the United States still has is Puerto Rico. It's a unique situation in Puerto Rico because although it's not a state, it still has some powers as a state would in the United States. So federalism, how does the courts and legislature work? Within the federal system, national courts typically resolve disputes between subnational governments, of course, that meaning states, and some national governments also have representation within the national legislature, which of course allows for regional concerns to influence national law. So you can see here in a unitary system, so there's three different systems, general systems of government, unitary, federations, and confederations. So in a unitary system, it's basically the authority is given by the national government. They have the complete power, and of course, states have to follow with them. So you can see that in example, United Kingdom, Japan, and Sweden. In a federation, you have, of course, the people, right, as we talked about last week, the people elect representatives to represent them in government, and of course within that it's divided between states and national government. So the power is divided between states and national government. Of course that's divvied up between the people. So the national government allows states to have rules or powers over certain issues, but of course the national government has powers and authorities that it takes care of, because of course the national government can't be everywhere and everywhere. And of course can't regulate every single state, and of course that's why in federation it gives the states some powers to do that, and we'll talk about that. And so of course we function as federation. Of course Canada also functions as that. A confederation is where the states have the ultimate power and it gives it to the national government. We had that in the United States actually had a confederation under the Articles of Confederation. If you remember from last chapter, we talked about that. So before we had the United States Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which this function, of course, did not work out very well. So again, the two alternatives to federalism, which I just talked about, was a unitary system, which of course you have the heavy power relies on the national government, and of course in a confederate government is which all of the powers focus on the states. And of course, we realized in the United States that a confederate system does not work very well. Several provisions of the U.S. Constitution define the powers of the national government and state governments, and we'll talk about that. So what powers does each one have? So the federal government has what is called enumerated powers. That includes coining money, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, conduct foreign affairs, declare war, raise and support armies, regulate postal system, establish copyright patent laws, powers denied, tax state exports, change state boundaries, and of course violate the Bill of Rights. So a federal government cannot do those things. The concurrent powers, of course, that is work hand in hand, establish courts, charter banks and corporations, take private for public use, so that is called eminent domain. So eminent domain is when the federal government or the state government deems that this should be used for public purposes. Property can be deemed as eminent domain. So for example, there is a high school in Illinois out in the suburbs. It's called Morton West. And at that school, there's behind the high school in the parking lot, there is a chain of there's a mall of stores, and one of the major stores wanted to take over the parking lot of the school, but it would be damn near impossible to do so because of eminent domain, since the high school is a state institution. It's a public high school of the state of Illinois. It would be almost near impossible for the private business to buy up the parking lot, because all the high school has to do is declare eminent domain, and it would not be able to take over that property. In state government, we have reserve powers, of course. State government, they regulate interstate commerce, conduct elections, provide public health and safety, establish local governments, maintain a militia, which is the National Guard. Of course, the state governments cannot tax imports and exports. They cannot coin their own money. They cannot enter into treaties. They cannot impair obligation of contracts. And of course, they cannot violate the individual's rights. Just to talk about it, enumerated powers, right? In Article 1, Section 8, you can see that the U.S. Congress can do this. And actually about declaring war, the last time, a little trivia here, the last time the United States Congress actually declared war was World War II. After that, Congress never declared war on a country, officially declared war. There was conflicts that we've had, but U.S. Congress actually wrote Declaration of War since World War II. Necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 states that Congress also has the power to make all laws which is necessary and proper for carrying and executing the foreign powers. So, of course, we also have, which is also the illicit clause, or also known as the necessary and proper clause. So if they deem that's necessary to do so, then of course they can do it. Reserve power states also the Constitution does not enumerate the powers of state governments. So, of course, the framers of the Constitution believe that states possess reserve powers, which all power not prohibited by the states by the Constitution are delegated to the national government. So the 10th Amendment enshrines the reserve powers of states. So whatever the national government does not take care of, we give the Constitution gives reserve powers to the states to make those laws and take it into their hands. So, for example, there are criminal justice laws. Some states vary throughout the nation as to how their criminal justice system works. For example, some states allow for capital punishment, others do not allow for capital punishment. But of course, though, the U.S. Constitution, the United States federal government leaves most of the criminal justice system to states to determine that. Article 1, Section 10 restricts the power of the states to enact certain areas. So, of course, any state cannot enter into a treaty with foreign governments. Of course, they can, there's been states out there that have worked with foreign companies to establish factories, but that's one thing. But, Oklahoma cannot, for example, the state of Oklahoma or Illinois or the governor of Florida cannot go to, say, United Kingdom and form its own treaty, right, with the foreign government. Cannot do that. The United States government does that. A state like Oklahoma or California cannot coin its own money. And, of course, can't levy tax on imports or exports. So, further restrictions of state power, right, restraints on state power. The 14th Amendment prohibits the states from denying individual rights under the Constitution, and, of course, protecting civil rights of individuals. The U.S. Supremacy Clause states that U.S. Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land. So at the end of the day, states do have their reserve powers, but however, at the end of the day, federal law supersedes that of any treaty, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So, for example, if the state of Florida wanted to make its own treaty or supersede the law of the federal government, it cannot do so. Under the Supremacy Clause, U.S. Constitution, federal law, treaties prevail over a conflicting state law as long as the federal government is acting within its constitutional authority. Distribution of finances. Federal, state, and local governments rely primarily on taxation. So you can see here when you go to your local grocery store and you pay for an item or items and you look at your receipt, you'll see local and state taxes on your food. So, local government tax you, the state government. Sometimes certain items will tax you, and you'll see probably a bunch of other taxes on there. So, including perhaps your light bill, your gas bill, or natural gas bill. You'll see there. And of course, the federal government also taxes you because that is the way to raise revenue. So the 16th Amendment authorized Congress to tax the income of individuals without the apportioning into the states on the basis of population. So no matter what you do, folks, you have to pay your taxes. There's no other way around it. The federal government will find you because you have to pay your taxes. So you can see here that a lot of the states and of course federal government rely on taxes, and they have to tax people because that is the way to raise money. So of course, local taxes, you have your taxes there. For those who are homeowners, you have to pay property taxes. Of course, you have sales tax, and of course individual income tax. And of course in the state government as well when it comes to taxes. Excuse me. So, of course, how states raise revenue. State and local governments raise revenue through various taxes, as I mentioned. Income taxes. So, if you live in a particular state, you have to pay your income taxes. If you live in a state, all right, you have to pay your income taxes. If you're a homeowner, you have to pay property taxes, and of course, sales taxes, right? So, again, when you go purchase an item at a store, you have to pay sales tax. State governments raise about half the revenue through various taxes. So they will tax you, right? The federal budget, approximately 2/3 of the federal budget is spent on 3 categories. So the majority of it is spent on Social Security, healthcare, and health insurance programs, and of course, defense. So you can see here present each state's revenue coming from fuel taxes. So again, fuel taxes as well. So when you pay for money at the gas pump, that is also taxed as well. There has been some struggle between national and state governments in the early 1800s. Several decisions by the Supreme Court greatly expanded the national government's power. During that same period, states sought to curb the growing power of the national government by asserting their own powers. So Chief Justice John Marshall the famous case of Marbury versus Madison reinforced the influence and independence of the judiciary branch. So Marbury versus Madison was really one of the most important cases in U.S. history because it reinforced that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Slavery was one of the biggest conflicts that we've had in the United States. Slavery literally brought us to the brink. It did bring us to war, led to the U.S. Civil War. Because let's just face it, slavery was the biggest issue between national and state powers. So state powers wanted to continue slavery. The national government, always conflict whether or not. So, of course, after the Civil War, states no longer asserted a perceived right to challenge the Constitution and enacted federal laws. And, of course, the states that had left during the Civil War, in order to be readmitted to the Union, Congress ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments. So, dual federalism. Following the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877, of course, there was a period of marked dual federalism. The dual federalism refers to a political arrangement in which national governments and state governments act within distinct areas of jurisdiction. So the end of the Reconstruction era, so after the Civil War, we had a period of Reconstruction. During that time, of course, the southern states, as well as parts of the northern states, were preparing itself and allowing freed slaves to live in a free society. So here's a political cartoon from back in the day. Cooperative federalism. During the Great Depression, the United States entered a period of cooperative federalism where the national and state governments coordinated efforts to address the problem. So depression was a big problem, and instead of solving it by itself, there was a cooperation. So, of course, there was the time where a lot of federal programs were created. So the creation of social welfare programs, one of which was Social Security, came from that time period. Just a question for you. Describe the primary differences in the roles of citizens in government among the federal, confederation, and unitary systems. So think about that for a minute. And what are the differences? So you can see here, a soup kitchen in 1931, during the Great Depression era. And we go into new federalism, right? So in the early 1970s, President Richard Nixon attempted to restore state power in certain areas. And so in the 1980s, President Reagan continued Nixon's implementation of new federalism by decentralizing national power, increasing revenue sharing with state and local governments, and giving greater discretion to state and governments on how they spent their federal grant money. So you can see here a picture. Intergovernmental relations. The federal government may compel state governments to act in the national interest by offering some incentives. The federal government may mandate state actions in other areas without the provision of federal grants. So what that means is the federal government may tell states they have to follow certain rules or new compliances, but there's no money for it. So which is called a unfunded mandate. That is what it's called when the federal government tells that they have to follow actions, but we're not going to give you money for it. So you can see here in the past, right? So how do layer cake federalism, right? Programs and authorities are clearly divided amongst national state governments. And of course, what we have now is a mixture of authority of national, state, and local governments. So grants. In the 18th and 19th centuries, federal government also often used land grants to promote state action in certain areas. If you know the land grant institutions, every state in the United States has a land grant institution. That was formed during the President Lincoln actually formed the land grant institutions to provide public education, higher education, to people. At that time, at the time period of President Lincoln and before him, the institutions of higher education were basically for the wealthy. There were private institutions like your Harvards, your Yales, your Princetons, your William and Marys. They were private institutions. So because of land grants, they promote higher education. So every state has one. So in Oklahoma, for example, it's Oklahoma State University. Michigan State University is one. So since the late 19th century, the federal government has primarily used cash grants to promote state and local governments to undertake certain actions. So we have two types of grants. We have the categorical grants, typically contain more restrictions on how the grant recipients to use their discretion, and of course block grants allow greater discretion by the recipient with lesser conditions and less administrative oversight. So federal grants to state and local governments from 1960 to 2018, as you can see, the majority has been used for health. Unfunded mandates, as I had mentioned previously, unfunded mandates are federal laws or regulations that require state and local governments to undertake certain obligations without the federal government providing the money. So, for example, if the federal government, there was a new law, federal law or regulation, and it told states, local government, that you have to follow this, but we're not going to give you money. You have to make up your own way of how you're going to compensate for this new mandate. That is what we call unfunded mandate. So the federal government uses unfunded mandates to compel state or local action on education, environmental protection, civil rights protection, and homeland security. Contested issues. Of course, sometimes within the federal system, federal policies don't always align with with state and local government policies. Sometimes some states buck against the federal system of government. And so we've seen those issues come up. So some contested issues where states have bucked back against federal government when it comes to issues such as immigration, right? And the immigration issue, every state, has a different stance on immigration. Some states are harsher on immigration. Some states are less harsher on immigration. And when I mean about immigration, I mean undocumented individuals. So again, every state has its own way of dealing with that issue. Same-sex marriage. Before the federal government stepped in, every state had its own form of what is considered same-sex marriage. Some accepted it, some didn't. And of course, legalization of marijuana. Every state had its own format of how they see legalization of marijuana. So you can see here about immigration. Strategizing about new issues, right? Interest groups may seek to shift policy, and we'll talk about interest groups in later chapters. So they always want to find ways and strategize as how they can influence national state policies. So, of course, here you can see same-sex marriage. So, of course, this was cases. So, you can see here between 2009 and 2015, the states in red allowed for same-sex marriage, and of course in red it was banned, and of course the yellowish was disputed. So you can see here in 2009 the states that allowed, you can see there's not many states that allowed for same-sex marriage, and of course you can see here as time went on, same-sex marriage was allowed. Benefits of federalism. Federalism encourages innovative approaches to social and economic policies. So one of the great things about federalism is that it allows for states and national government to pursue certain policies and see how they best fit. So, allows pays for issues that are important. Sometimes it takes state initiatives to allow for a better form of government, or vice versa. Sometimes the government has to take initiative. Of course, there are some drawbacks to federalism. Disparities in education, environmental protection. Unfortunately, when it comes to education, mostly K-12 public education, not every state, because the federal government does not get involved usually with K-12 public education and gives the states the majority of the power to focus on K-12 education. Not every state in the union has a superb education system. There are some states that have really great education, and other states do not do such a good job of education. Of course, environmental protection. Some states protect their environment, others are not so serious about environmental protection, and of course, healthcare. So, what are the merits and drawbacks of American federalism? Right? Think about that. So, we just talked about that, about American federalism, the drawbacks, the good and the bad. So, think about it. What are the merits and drawbacks of American federalism? Thank you for joining me on this Chapter 3, American Federalism.